Hello and welcome. This will be a reteaching of Week 7. In this class we learned about the GameObject class using the class variables or the fields of the transform class and the instantiate method. So let's look at what we have and what we want to get. So if we hit play on the starting scene, we have this guy and he walks around and he has some kind of weapon. Looks like it's in his right hand. And he's going to walk around, rotate, etc. So we have on the horizontal axis, left and right, he turns. And the forward and backward is with the vertical axis. Alright, so this little mini tank guy. What we want to do is be able to like shoot a bullet, fire a bullet, but we're not going to color the bullet, we're going to color the projectile, because this could be for any kind of projectile type of functionality that you would want. Okay? Even if it's making one thing go in a certain direction, but the way we're going to do this is how you want to create objects, kind of out of thin air. You just want to be able to create the object instead of setting it up inside of the scene whenever you're designing your projects. So what we want to do is use the instantiate method. But before we get there, we need to think about what are some things that we're trying to do here. We're going to create an object, right? We're going to create it in the hierarchy, and it's pretty much going to appear from the project. It's going to be a prefab here, and it's going to appear inside of your scene, inside of your hierarchy. So whenever we think about what is something we want to change or to be able to change, usually that needs some kind of variable. If we're going to change some value, we need something, something to change, and that's pretty much the definition of a variable. So if we're going to create an object, we need to have a variable to store that object in. Okay? Now, the thing to keep in mind, and one thing that we saw in the reading and in class, is that all scripts are classes, right? And all classes can be types of variables. Like int. Int is a class in its own way, and it can be a variable type. Float, same thing. And we've seen that we can have transforms and rigid bodies as be types for variables. So game objects themselves can be a type of a variable. So when we use the game object class, and remember that game objects comprise any object in a scene, and all of the components that it has as well, and all of the settings that that prefab or that game object may have. Okay? It has a lot of useful methods and fields. We're only going to concentrate on one, set enabled. We'll look at that one after we actually set this up as a variable. The idea with this function is we can set something to be enabled or disabled inside of the scene also by using this class. So we're going to see how to use it as a variable, and we're going to see how to call this function on a variable of this class, an instance of this class, and to be able to set any object to be enabled or disabled that we have in the scene. Alright, so let's say inside of the scene we're going to just go ahead and make a simple script. And we'll call this enable object with space. Now what this is going to do is it's going to be a very simple input that whenever we press the spacebar, it's going to enable or disable whatever object we tell it to. Anytime today. Go ahead and load up there. Okay. So we're always going to be waiting for that input. So let's put this in the update method. I'll give it a comment. Alright. Remember that comments don't get ran by the code. They're user readable, or programmer readable. It's like leaving notes for yourself, right? So I'm going to say this will wait for a press of the spacebar. Now I could do input. Say, well, better start it out with an if, I guess. If input get key key code space. Alright, so I could do it this way, but I don't like using getKey. I've already explained in class why I don't like using getKey. It's just making yourself more work later. So instead of doing that, we're going to use getAxis, and the axis for that's with the space bar is the jump. So we're going to use that. Better capitalize that. Now, getAxis returns a 1 or a 0, so keep in mind that I can't just use getKeyDown. I need to say compare this to something. Now, with the getAxis jump, there's only one key, and that's the positive key. So we're going to just do if this is greater than or equal to 0.5. Now, the reason I want to do 0.5 is because I don't want it to happen as soon as the button is pressed. I want it to just have a little bit of a pause, right? Well, let's do it less. Just a tiny pause. Alright, so, and this will kind of factor in dead zones too. So what I'm going to do is, inside of this, I'm going to enable or disable a game object. That's it. So let's first create a field up here, a variable that's going to hold, or it's going to show in the inspector that's going to hold a reference to whatever game object that we want to be able to turn on or off. Okay? And we'll just call this object to toggle. Alright, so whenever public game object. And keep in mind that this needs to be capitalized G, capitalized O. So now we can use this and say object to toggle set active. Alright, so set active. Did I say that wrong over here? Yeah, set enable is for a component, sorry. Well, set active is for a game object. So if you took this as notes over here, as set enabled, this is for components. This was a mistake by me. So set active. Alright, so if we look at set active, let's see what it's requiring. It requires a bool. So this activates or deactivates the game object. So it needs to have a bool value, true or false. So I'll say true. And what this will do is it will activate a game object. If I have set active and I say false, it will deactivate it. There is no function for set deactivate or deactivate. It's just set active false. Okay? So let's save this. And we'll go back to Unity. And let's just drag this on the player. That's where we've been putting all of our input. I don't like doing that, but when we go to the actual project, we won't be doing it that way. Alright, so enable object with space. We'll apply it with this, and then let's go and find it. And we need to assign whatever object it is that we want to deselect or disable whenever we hit space. So let's just do the let's do the entire weapon. Alright, hit play. So he's moving, he's rotating, space key. Alright, so that's disabled now. And as you can see, what you're doing whenever you use this command is the little check mark that has things enabled or disabled, you're toggling that on or off. So that's what this command does. You need to call it from a game object variable, and then just tell it to set active false to disable it. Now if we do set active true, and we start it out as being disabled, alright, so he's moving around, press space, now he has a weapon. Alright, so with the game object now as a variable, we can use this object or this same technique to create something that's not in the scene. Now you can see we can easily toggle something on or off as it's already on the scene or in the scene, right? But what if it's not inside of the hierarchy? What if it's inside of the project and we want to just create it at runtime whenever the game's already playing? So that's where the method that we're going to use, instantiate, comes in. Oh, go away. Alright, to instantiate means quite literally to create an instance. This was one of the things that the reading talked about, was an instance of a class. Keep in mind that all scripts are components, almost always. But they are also classes. Classes are blueprints for expected behavior of an object with the class as a component. So it's essentially, if you take a component or a script that you've designed and drag it onto an object, you've made an instance of that class, because you've brought it from theory into, as far as the game's concerned, tangibility. So down here, over here in Unity, down here it's just an idea. Down here it's a blueprint. Whenever you bring it into the game, you're making an instance of it. To bring it into the game, usually what you do is attach it to an object that's existing inside of the scene. So this is the class, and whenever they appear on an object that's inside of the scene, that's the instance. So the instantiate function requires 3 arguments. First, it requires an object. Obviously, if we're going to create an object, well, what object are we going to create? Now, in this case, what we're instantiating is a prefab. Okay, we're not instantiating just a script. You can't just instantiate a script. You can add it as a component to an object, but we'll get to that some other time. Right now, we have to keep in mind that what we're doing is creating a prefab, and if you remember, a prefab is like designing what an object is going to have. It has all of the components, all of the settings and everything of an object, but prefabs exist down here in the project as well. They don't exist inside of the scene until we drag them in. Well, what Instantiate does is let us drag them in without actually dragging them in. We just drag them in, make them appear out of nothingness, right? So if we're going to create an object, well, here's the 2 questions. You say, hey, I want you to create this object. What's the next question? Okay, where? Okay, so you need to give them the position. where do you want me to create this object? And the next position, okay, well, what way do you want it to face? Which way is it going to face? This is a 3D environment. You probably want it to be oriented in a certain way. Which way do you want me to face it? And that's what the next one is, the orientation. Okay? So let's look at this. Where do you think we want to create a bullet? We want to create it over here on the floor? Probably not. Do we want to create it in the middle of the person? Unless we want it bursting out of his chest? Probably not. We probably want to create it at the end of the gun barrel. So it looks like it gets created there and then propels forward. Okay? So we know we're going to create a projectile. We're going to create it here. So which way should it be facing? Well, if we just leave it facing this way, as long as our character is always facing that way, there will be no problem. But as soon as he turns, that location is no longer adequate. So what we want to do is actually to get this position to, or the orientation of it. Now, sometimes this doesn't actually work if you just use the parent. It's still going to be facing the wrong way. But there's a quick fix for that. We can just turn it manually. Alright, so let's go do that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that create object with space, or sorry, enable object with space key. And I want to make another new script. And it's going to be fire projectile. And I'm going to open fire projectile. So just like the enable with space, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use the jump key, so the space key. Let's go ahead and grab that. Go over here into update, paste it. But we don't have object to toggle, so we'll go over here, and no we won't, because we're not going to use this anyway, and I'm going to make a different variable name, obviously. So let's look. Instantiate. Instantiate, like I said, calls for 3 different arguments. The object that you're going to create, where you're going to create it, and the position or the orientation that it's going to have. This type quaternion, it's kind of like Euler angles, but no, it's not like Euler angles. Euler angles is the converse to this. Well, it's just an orientation of 3D space. Just put it that way. The only thing we need to do is that we can actually grab some information to get this automatically. We don't need to calculate this. So what we're going to do is think about, well, if we're looking inside of Unity and we look at this player, we look at this weapon, is there anything on here that we can use to kind of get some information about location? Well, of course, the transform. The transform component exists on all of these. So we can get the information of any transform that we want pretty easily. And again, transform is also a type. So let's go up here and start creating our variables. The first one we need, since we need all of these things for this function, we should make 3 variables for this, right? But for this one, the vector 3 position and rotation, these are both on the transform. So we can just use one variable for these. So let's make a public game object, and we'll call it projectile fired, or to fire. And let's make a public transform called fire position. So inside of Instantiate, let's go ahead and enter that information. So what object are we going to fire? We're going to fire projectile to fire. Where are we going to fire it from? Fire position dot position. So this transform component, we're going to grab some information from it, a variable or a field called position. And the next one, we're going to grab fire position dot rotation. Again, a field that's contained on all transforms. What kind of errors am I working with here? Instantiate this at this position with this rotation. So we'll switch back over to Unity. And let's go ahead and apply that. It says I have an error here, but I don't have an error there. I think I forgot to save it. Alright, so we're good to go now. So inside of the projectile to fire in the project file, I've given you a projectile prefab. Now if you don't have this projectile prefab, for whatever reason, you can just create a sphere, drag it down into prefabs, and now you've made a prefab of that sphere. Right, so you can make as many of that type of sphere as you want. Now any components that you add to that will be on that prefab as well. Right? Now obviously we don't need that. I have the projectile. Alright, so we're going to use the projectile to fire. Right? And let's go ahead and use the fire point, which is at the very end, and we'll use that as our position to fire from. Alright, so let's give it a try. Looks like it works the way as intended. Of course, it's firing non-stop, and we'll have to come back to address that later, unless you want the guy to just shoot water. That'd actually be pretty cool. Now, there is another problem as well. Keep in mind that every time you create one of these projectiles, you are taking up memory on whatever device it's playing on. So you could fire enough of these projectiles and the computer would probably start slowing down relatively quickly. Well, probably not. These are simple projectiles. It would take a little while, but it would eventually slow down. If I go to my scene and zoom out, we can see that all of the ones that I fired are still there. Still moving. So we want to destroy these over a certain amount of time, right? Now, if we look at the projectile and see what it does, it has one script attached to it and just a particle system. If we open up the script, the only thing it does is it translates, so it moves all the time in the forward vector, so the z-axis, at time.delta time times speed times 10 right? That's all it does. It moves all the time. But we want for this object not, well, to be destroyed over a certain amount of time. Now, to do this, we're going to use, first of all, we're going to bring in our start method because we want to run something as soon as this object comes instantiated. So what we want to do is use the destroy function, and what it does is it takes two parameters, or optionally one. You can just give it the object, but something else you can do is give it a time. So we can give it a kind of a countdown timer before it will destroy itself. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to, at start, call destroy, and we'll say 5 seconds. In 5 seconds, destroy this object. Now the update will still keep running. It'll keep flying, and then after 5 seconds, it'll just be destroyed. So what do we want to destroy? Game object. And that means that the game object that this is attached to, the script is attached to, that's what game object is. And let's say 5 seconds as a float. Let's go ahead and test that out. Rotate around, boom, boom, boom. And they are gone. You can see from the hierarchy they disappeared. Fire a few here. Go to the scene. And they disappear. So we know how to create some objects now and how to destroy some objects. We also know how to enable or disable some objects. We also know how to find the position of any object because we can simply grab the transform off of that object and access the position and rotation fields. And this can be used for any object in the scene so long as it does have a transform, which is pretty much everything. Need to keep in mind we need to have variables to hold these different things. Game objects, transforms, these are classes, these are types. So if you want to have something you can just drag and drop and then do stuff to it, you need to make a variable to hold them. Okay? Keep in mind that we can also call the setActive function on any object and disable or enable it. This is for an object that's already in the scene. This is for an object that's not in the scene yet but is a prefab inside of the project. Alright, so that covers everything we covered in class. The next video will be going to the homework section, and in this section we're going to learn about OnCollisionEnter, OnTriggerEnter, and we just learned to destroy. So pretty much these two.